We're going to go to a 7-minute round, starting with Mr. Lukiski.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here today. Before I begin with my questions, I just want to, for the record, perhaps set something straight. There was commentary that was provided by Mr. Lamoureux's mirror image, Mr. Sims, who was with us during the presentation by Mr. Neufeld, and that is that Mr. Sims brought the example forward of a woman in a care facility in his home province, in his riding actually, who he stated would not have been able to vote without the voter information card, because he said it was the only possible piece of identification that showed where she lived. I point out that's absolutely false, because contained in the Act is the ability for seniors who live in care facilities to merely get an attestation from the head of the facility saying this woman lives here. That's all they need. So she would have been able to vote despite the protestations of Mr. Sims, and I want to have that on the record. Now, my question, I think I'll first start with Mr. Fox, because as I think most Canadians know who are paying any attention after the last election, the biggest controversy surrounded the robocall situation and Pierre Poilievre. The still unknown Pierre Poilievre, who apparently had a fairly widespread and apparently fairly orchestrated attempt of voter suppression. Now, the Fair Elections Act, Bill C-23, deals with that very situation in that it uses the CRTC, as a central repository for all voter contact services to register. And in fact, without going into all of the details, because I know, Mr. Fox, your organization did fairly extensive studies on voter contact services. But when I asked the former Chief Electoral Officer Kingsley, who testified before this committee on Tuesday, if he believed the provisions contained in the Fair Elections Act would prevent that very situation from occurring in the future, he said yes, an unequivocal yes. I would like your opinion, since your organization did so much work on this very issue, about the government's proposal on regulating voter contact services and the role of the CRTC that is contained in Bill C-23.
Thanks very much. I'm not sure we can answer that question in absolutes, in the sense that there will always be an exception. What I would say is I think the provisions that are contained in the Act, which echo a lot of the recommendations that we put forward in our report, would add a deterrent by raising the bar on what happens to you if you get caught. But I think in a response to 2011, the forced creation of a paper trail and the keeping of records all the way to who authorized the communication, who was communicated to, and what the script was that was used in those communications, I think will really help after the fact if there needs to be an investigation, which in itself would be a deterrent. The last thing I would say is I also appreciate that the provisions aren't technology specific. And that you didn't fall into the trap of going too far down into the specifics of was it a cell phone versus was it something else, was it a recorded message versus a text, which will allow you to keep up with technological advancement.
I guess on behalf of our chair I can say that now we do have 7-minute rounds. You can probably take a little bit more time and be deliberate in your answers, because I would like to get a fulsome response to this. Let's concentrate on the CRTC. In effect, the Act will make the CRTC almost like a one-stop shop of sorts. Do you agree with the approach of using the CRTC as a central repository to try and record all of these calls that are being made and have an accurate record of who is making the calls, what they are saying, and to whom they're directed? Is this something that your organization approves of?
Absolutely, and I think the addition of requiring the service provider to register, I think again is an added safeguard if we ever need to go back to things that have happened in the past, and we'll share some responsibility and make it more explicit. So I think that's positive, and you will have seen in our document that actually the CRTC, current and former, had representatives in our group at our roundtable, and I would never pretend to speak for them, but I would say that there was a lot of support for the idea of the two organizations, Elections Canada and CRTC, working together to help regulate this. So I think there'll be a lot of support even from them in acting in that way going forward. Thank
you for that, and I think your comments echo what Mr. Kingsley was saying, and Mr. Kingsley did go a little further. You mentioned that you were not here to give any absolutes. He, in effect, did. He said his examination of the bill, with the provisions contained regarding what we commonly know now as robocalls, would prevent that orchestrated voter suppression attempt by whoever Pierre Poilievre is from occurring in the future. One thing, however, still is, I guess, up for discussion, and that is how long records should be kept. In Bill C-23, the Fair Elections Act recommends that all records are kept for 1 year, so that there is a record of what's happening and what occurred in terms of script, calls made, calls received, that type of thing. Some of the opposition is criticizing that. We feel 1 year is a pretty good balance, because right now there's no requirement to keep records for any period of time. One of the reasons we're suggesting 1 year would be adequate is that if there is to be another situation, hopefully there will not, but if there's another situation where something like a voter suppression through a robocall system is alerted, all probability the investigation would commence almost immediately. And with the trail that we propose to regulate now, we feel that 1 year would be adequate. But does your organization have any thoughts on whether keeping records for 1 year is adequate, too little?
That time period is beyond the scope of our report. I would say, however, that 1 year is definitely better than what we have now, which is nothing. I completely agree with you. But given the marginal additional costs of keeping that record once it's been put together for perhaps a longer period, may not be too onerous on parties and service providers, and may give more time for issues and events to come to the surface after an election. And so I'd be open-minded about it being longer than 1 year, for sure.
You have about 4 seconds. Madam Des Rosiers, you wanted to add something very, very quickly on Mr.
Very quickly. At UFT last week there was a big debate, and one of the recommendations was that it be expanded to 5, and someone went as far as 10 years. But certainly I think there was the idea that a bit longer would just make the appearance all clear.
Super. Thank you. Mr. Scott, 7 minutes from you today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to give the last 2 minutes to Ms. May, if that's possible, and if you could call me at 5 minutes.
Stop you at 5 and give the last 2 to Ms. May.
Thank you. I just wanted to, I appreciate the line of questioning with Tom and Mr. Fox, and I think it's fair. Everybody, this is going to be better than nothing, the registry system. I think it's a bit of a stretch to say Mr. Kingsley said unequivocally yes, that it would prevent in an absolute way. He had criticisms that numbers won't be kept and that 1 year was too short. That's the minimum. And we also talked about off the books. Anybody who's really going to engage in a concerted effort these days knows that the system's in place and will use sophisticated technology, perhaps proxy servers, off the book servers, burner phones, etc. And the problem is, the system, the registry system, doesn't really account for that. And so I'm just wondering if, Mr. Fox, whether you would agree that the failure to include things to do with enhancing the investigative powers, the other end of deterrence is people will know that it will be properly investigated. The lack of compulsion of witness, I don't know whether you agree that it should be there, but that is a fact, it will make it more difficult to investigate. Is that true?
Again, that goes beyond the scope of the work that we conducted. There was certainly a lot of discussion in our group of experts about whether or not we should consider enhancing the investigative powers of Elections Canada or the Commission of Canada Elections, rather. And so, generally speaking, I think our group would have said there's room for improvement. We didn't get into the specifics of what those proposals might be.
That's great, thank you. And I also do want to thank you, as well as to note the fact that Professor Des Rosiers pointed out the problems of restrictions on research, and under the current Section 20 sub 1, the Treasury Board's approval will be required for the hiring of temporary specialists. The hiring of you to do that robocall research in the future would require the Treasury Board to approve that. And I just want everybody to know that that kind of work is precisely the kind of work that the Chief Electoral Officer should not be second-guessed on. So I thank you for the work. I wanted to also quickly ask Ms. Loat. The Minister has a propensity to take praise and blow it up. So when you say, quote, Mr. Poilievre is correct in highlighting that parties and candidates play a critical role in encouraging participation, I don't disagree. The fact of the matter is we do. We do that primarily through trying to encourage people to vote for us for the substantive reasons. And I think that's a very valid way to try to increase participation. My problem is with his all-or-nothing vision that that's the only way citizens should be motivated. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody realizes that you're also recommending keeping the general public education function of Elections Canada, and that parties themselves should continue and do a better job motivating as well. Is that correct?
That's correct. In our submission and also in my remarks, we had 3 recommendations on increasing citizen engagement and education both during and in between elections that would be done in nonpartisan as well as multipartisan ways. We do believe that political parties and candidates have an extremely important role to play in engaging electorate, and our research suggests that there's a big bridge between where they could be and where they are, at least in the eyes of citizens, and I do have concern about the low credibility that political parties have in the eyes of the public, and as I said, particularly given the quite generous public subsidies they receive. So I think efforts, I mentioned 2 points about Elections Canada. One, strengthening the role and encouraging them to do a better job. Secondly, having a innovative funding and research program that's based on what we know works, whether Elections Canada is asked to measure results and share those and communicate those so that there's a broader understanding of what we can do to encourage greater voter participation. And thirdly, I do suggest that some of the additional funds provided for political parties in this bill be allocated to voter education, so that political parties are sending a message that they are serious about the very severe decline in participation, particularly among young people in this country.
Great. Thank you for amplifying your presentation. And now I think I'm just out of time, and Ms. May can go.
Very convenient. Ms. May, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to start by thanking Craig Scott for being so generous with his time. I don't think we ever hear enough from witnesses when they're on panels and forced to speak so quickly. So I want to ask one question, which I will ask each of you to speak to, and I hope you can get as much as you can into your time and still breathe. All of you represent nonpartisan, nonprofit organizations with expertise in the issues currently plaguing Canada in terms of voter turnout and fair elections. I appreciate your evidence today. I want to know from each of you, do you believe C-23, the so-called Fair Elections Act, will help or hurt the health of Canadian democracy?
Well, thanks. I'll give you the answer you don't want to hear, which is it's not passed yet, which means there's lots of room for all the changes that I think we've suggested. That's my answer.
I would agree with Taylor. I think there's a lot of room for important changes to the bill, but I think if those changes come through, it will help.
It's very important that some attention be paid to the robocalls issue, but if it can be split off and the rest of it be engaged in a more fruitful debate, I think that's what we're suggesting. Improvement is needed.
I think I probably agree with everybody. There's some good aspects, but lots of opportunity for improvement.
From my point of view, and having had a chance to speak to the bill at second reading, I made it clear I also support the regulation of robocalls and the way that that's being handled. I think the key significant pieces that need to be reformed before the bill passes are relating to getting rid of the vouching provisions, getting rid of the voter ID cards, and getting rid of Elections Canada's role in public education. If those pieces aren't improved before passage, would you believe this bill does more to hurt or help Canadian democracy?
Very short answer from each of them. Second each.
I do think that diminishing the role of Elections Canada will be bad for Canada.
Agreed.
Based on our work, it would have to be no.
My health card, embarrassingly enough, is my only piece of official ID, and it doesn't have my address on it. So my wife couldn't vouch for me right now. That's my personal opinion, but obviously I have a couple of years, hopefully, to fix that.
I'm proud of anyone who at your age doesn't have a driver's license. Thank you very much for your testimony.
I have the TTC.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. May.